well, let's get started. I'm so excited to welcome you to BarkFest. Thank you for coming. I would love to know where you're joining us from, so please let me know in the chat. And I can see someone already knew that I was going to ask about that, so thank you. Would love to know where you all are. And I'm Zazie Todd. I'm the author of WAG, The Science of Making Your Dog Happy, Purr, The Science of Making Your Cat Happy, and my new book, Bark, The Science of Helping Your Anxious, Fearful, or Reactive Dog is available for pre-order now. And Bark really was the impetus for organizing BarkFest, and I'm so thrilled to hear from all of these authors. And today I'm lucky enough to be on the panel myself. So Kelly S. Thompson, national best-selling author of Still I Cannot Save You, says that Bark is full of practical solutions and tips for even the most fearful of canines, all backed by extensive research, witty personal stories, and tales of Todd's own beloved animals. So thank you for coming today. I have some housekeeping to do first of all. So the recording is going to go out after about 72 hours because that gives me time to check the recording. Everyone who is here live has the chance to win copies of some books, and we're going to have 3 winners today. One of those winners is going to win a copy of Bark, a signed copy of What the Dog Knows, and copies of 2 of Marc Bekoff's books, The Emotional Lives of Animals and Dogs Demystified. So Dogs Demystified is the one that he's talking about today, but we have another session with Marc talking about The Emotional Lives of Animals, and that is almost full. So if you want to sign up for that one, I recommend going to sign up for that one as soon as possible. And so one person will win all 4 of those books, and 2 other people are also going to win a signed copy of What the Dog Knows from Cat, which is amazing. So I will do the draw for that afterwards because I have to allow a bit of time for processing to see who's actually been here live, and then I'll do the draw and email someone this afternoon. And so I'd also like to point out that we have a chat box and a Q&A box, and please put your questions into the Q&A because that makes it easy for us to find them at the end. Things tend to whiz by too fast in the chat. It's lovely to see so many of you here. I'm so excited for this session, and Christy, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce our 2 amazing guests.
Great, thank you, Zazie. So Marc Bekoff is Professor Emeritus of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. He has published 31 books, or 41, depending on how you count multi-volume encyclopedias, and has won many awards for his research on animal behavior, animal emotions, cognitive ethology, compassionate conservation, and animal protection. He's worked closely with Jane Goodall as the co-chair of the Ethics Committee of the Jane Goodall Institute, and is a former Guggenheim Fellow. He also works closely with inmates at the Boulder County Jail. In June of 2022, Marc was recognized as a hero by the Academy of Dog Trainers. His recent books include Dogs Demystified, an A to Z guide to all things canine, the 2nd edition of The Emotional Lives of Animals, and Jane Goodall at 90, celebrating an astonishing lifetime of science, advocacy, humanitarianism, hope, and peace. He also publishes regularly for Psychology Today. Kat Warren is the author of the New York Times bestseller, What the Dog Knows, Scent, Science, and the Amazing Ways Dogs Perceive the World, published by Touchstone. It was longlisted for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. She also wrote What the Dog Knows for Young Readers, published by Simon & Schuster Books for Young Readers. A retired professor from North Carolina State University, she currently researches and writes about scent detection dogs and archaeology. She lives in Durham, North Carolina with her husband, David, a German Shepherd Rev, and an adorable Boykin Spaniel, who I love watching go by on Facebook, named Brio. So now we're going to pose for a photo quickly. So if everyone wants to hold up their books, I have nothing to hold up today, so I'm unprepared. Oh,
whoops.
I bark.
That's in front of your face, Marc. We need to see your face too, please. Thank you. Oh yeah,
That's probably long enough.
That works. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to hop right in for questions for Marc. Marc, Dogs Demystified is like an encyclopedia of everything you need to know about dogs. How did you come up with the idea for a book in this format?
Well, I came up with it over the years when people would send me questions about what dogs are doing. And I'm an ethologist, and so I take a slightly different perspective on dog behavior. I'm interested in the evolution of behavior. I'm really interested also in the behavior of dogs in different situations, like home dogs, feral dogs, and free-ranging dogs. And I just thought, I did 3 encyclopedias some years ago, and I vowed never to do anything like it again. But I really got into it, if you will. And then Joan Baez, who's a well-known singer friend, she said she would do all the original drawings for it. So I thought, well, might as well do that too. So basically, that's why I wrote the book.
Very cool. I love hearing your observations about dog parks and reading about, you sitting in dog parks and watching dogs and thinking about it and getting all these interesting questions. So what's your favorite thing about watching dogs in a dog park situation?
That they're running free mostly, and they just have freedom to choose agency, we call it, what they're going to do. I mean, the downside is that sometimes people come to dog parks and all they're saying is no, 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 no. And I actually did a little study of what I call helicopter dogging, if you will. I suppose it's parenting. And really, about 85% of the time, the people there, and this is over many, many years, are saying no or stop or don't do that. But I love seeing dogs run free and just choose with whom to play or hump and mount.
Yeah, for sure. I've always met really enjoyable people at dog parks too. So I read a line in your book, and I know we're not talking about this book this time, so maybe I should have punted this question to next session, but it's here anyway. So in your book, The Emotional Lives of Animals, you wrote, "What animals feel is more important than what they know," which I just loved. I actually started a blog with that as the title because I love that quote so much. So it's striking. It's so concise. What do you mean by this?
Well, there's no evidence across any animals I know, including humans, that intelligence, cognitive capacities are related at all to degrees of suffering, for example. And Jeremy Bentham, a utilitarian philosopher in the 1780s, basically said, the real question is not can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? And so I say that just because a lot of people think, well, dogs suffer more than mice. I'm a biologist at heart, and I'll say, well, I don't think dogs suffer more than mice or rats or rabbits. Each individual suffering is their own suffering, and that's what really counts when you interact with them.
So you're an ethologist, and you introduce the reader to ethology in a non-technical way, but in a way that's easy for us to understand, but also in a way that really opens the door to understanding what it is that you do. So what's your aim in telling people about ethology as a profession, as a discipline?
Well, I love what I do, and I've been doing it for decades, just carefully watching animals. I've studied wild coyotes in Wyoming for 8.5 years. I studied penguins in Antarctica, dogs around Boulder. I had students studying feral dogs, birds around Boulder. And it's just, to me, it's a treat to be able to just sit down and watch animals. And today on a bike ride, there were in East Boulder, there were 3 bobcat kittens playing right on the bike path. So of course I stopped and I introduced myself to them, and they didn't pay any attention to us at all. But this guy in a recycle pickup truck stopped. He jumped out and he went, "Oh my goodness, what's going on?" And I said, "Well, those are bobcat kittens." So I gave him a 5-minute lecture, and they were growling, and he said, "Well, they're fighting." And I said, "No, they're playing." And he said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I'll send you some papers because this is what I've been studying for years." And he had to get going. So what I love is watching the animals and, teaching other people, sort of a form of citizen science, if you will.
Right. Fantastic. Yeah. So what did you learn about dogs while working on the book, the encyclopedia book, that surprised you?
Well, what I learned was that a lot of people get dogs and have never had a course in dog 101. That was another reason I wrote it and made it so accessible from A to Z, is because I think the best dog-human relationships will form when the human is educated in dog, if you will. And then you have to educate, especially for homed dogs or free-ranging dogs who are around humans, you've got to educate the dogs in human. So what I learned was that, there's just so many myths out there. People think dogs are your best friend, or we're dog best friends. No, no, we're not. I mean, dog abuse is pretty rampant, and dogs aren't unconditional lovers. If you've ever rescued a dog who's had a traumatic upbringing, they don't unconditionally love. And I hear a dog agreeing with me, which is nice. So that's basically it. Just trying to get people to, when they look at a dog doing something, to pay attention to body posture, gait, vocalizations, the possibility there are odors there that sometimes we detect and don't detect. And the other thing, because I am an ethologist interested in the evolution of behavior, is to remember that dogs all come from a common wolf ancestor, if you will, and they still have wolf genes and wolf engrams, circuits in their brain. So it's not to say dogs are wolves, they're not, but they're not dumbed down wolves either, because dogs do very well, especially in a human-dominated world.
Right, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I think just really quickly before we get you to do your reading, when you were talking earlier, we were talking about ethology. I'm going to stick in an extra question. How did you end up in that field? I mean, I don't think it's something that people, when you're a young person and you're thinking about going to university, it's not a field that hops to the top of the list. I don't even think I knew what it was until I got into dog training, to be honest. So what drew you there? What was your path there, getting into this as a discipline?
It was totally nonlinear. I was always a pretty high-end athlete, and that was really what made my life go. But I I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and I used to talk to all the animals and ask my folks what they were thinking and feeling. And so that thread was always there. And I spent a couple of years in an MD PhD program, and I decided this is something I really don't want to do. And I went to Washington University in St. Louis as an undergrad, and I left to go into get a master's degree and then go into medical school. And one day I got an alumni news that a man named Michael Fox, who did a lot of the early work on canid ethology, had shown up at Washington University. So I called him. I said, I'd like to be a student. And that was the beginning of the journey, but it was nonlinear.
Interesting.
So yeah.
So next up, yeah, I think we're gonna get you to do a reading for us. So if you want to let us know what you're gonna read, and I will go off camera and we'll all listen to you do your reading.
I'm just going to read from the beginning of Dogs Demystified, and mainly I'd like to just introduce it to you all. I've already said that I'm an ethologist, so the book is centered on probably 800 entries from A to Z. It's an easy to read, easy to use A to Z guide, a canopedia of all things dogs. It largely focuses on dog behavior, what dogs do and how and why they do it, in order to help you see, appreciate, and respect dogs for who they are and not what we want them to be. So a side note here, of course, is that all dogs are individuals and have individual personalities. So there's no individual or no the dog. There's just a whole lot of variation in their behavior. And it's called demystifying dogs because a large part of demystifying our canine companions is understanding how they sense their world, which is rather different from how we sense our world. And I hope this guide helps you get eye to eye, nose to nose, and ear to ear with dogs. And getting a good handle on what is happening inside a dog's head and heart is how we can minimize the border between them and us. So a side note there is, and I firmly believe this, that the more we know about dog behavior, the better human-dog relationships we can form. And it's really a potpourri. There's art, culture, ethics, animal welfare, well-being, conservation, and spirituality in here. And I write a lot about cognitive ethology, which is the study of animal minds, what's in them and how they work. So I will just go on a bit more. And so as an ethologist, I'm interested in questions of evolution, which I've already mentioned that dogs come from a common ancestor, and I'm really interested in how their different behavior patterns evolve and what they're good for. And that would be adaptation. And adaptation basically refers to how an individual adapts to their current situation. What causes behavior? It could be neuronal, hormonal, or just a stimulus out in the world that they hear, see, or smell. And one of the great things that I learned as an ethologist early on doing field work is that ethologists have developed the idea of composite signals. So a tail wagging in one way may mean something, but you've got to pay attention to the whole dog, their head, their ears, their gait, their posture, their tail position, whether their head is cocked, how they're sort of turning their head to locate sounds and or odors. So the other thing is that people are always asking me questions, and when somebody says, I have a stupid question, that's when I really freeze, because the fact of the matter is there's no such thing as a stupid question. So, I mean, that's pretty much it. The book was a lot harder to write than I ever thought it would be, but I'm pleased the way it came out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. I will now ask questions of Zazie. So Zazie, about Bark, your latest book, why did you write this book?
I wanted to write something that was following the same pattern as WAG, namely bringing canine science to people, but for people with fearful dogs. And there was a long time when I was volunteering at my local shelter and working with a lot of dogs there, and with people who came to adopt the dogs and writing behavior plans for the dogs and so on. And I thought there are some really good books, especially Dr. Patricia McConnell's books. So we had the pleasure of speaking with her yesterday. But I wanted to bring something that brought modern canine science into it, because there's been such an explosion of studies about dogs. And as I found when I was writing WAG, The Science of Making Your Dog Happy, so much of it is relevant to our everyday life with dogs. But the thing is, a lot of people have fearful dogs. And one of those recent studies shows that almost 3/4 of dogs have some kind of fear or anxiety. And I know that people with fearful dogs really, really struggle. And so it's important for them to have good advice. And especially because there's so much, as Mark alluded to, so many myths about dogs, so much bad advice out there about dog training. So I wanted to put something that was practical, that was up to date, and which shared the best of what we know so far about dogs and how to help a fearful, anxious, or reactive dog. So it's full of practical tips, and that was my impetus for it. But really, I also wanted to bring the science to it because I find that so fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. And dogs deserve good science. So can you tell us about a time when you had a fearful or anxious dog and what you did to help the dog in your care?
So I have quite a few stories about my own dogs in Bark, and it's probably best to share one of those. So I used to have a dog called Bodger, and I wrote about him in WAG, but he's also mentioned in Bark as well. And when he first came to live with us, he was terrified of being touched, basically. He did not want to be petted. And if we looked at him, he would growl. And I was like, why is he growling when I'm only looking at him? But it was because he was worried that I might touch him. And in the early days with him, we had to take him to the vet with He had a thorn in his paw, but we couldn't get to look at his paw. And so this was a while ago. And so it took 4 people to sit on him at the vet in order to be able to look at his paw. They wouldn't do that now, I hasten to add. But that was how people did things then. And so he was really hard to handle. And then I was a student at the Academy for Dog Trainers, which was amazing. And one of the assignments there was to train a dog for vet handling, basically to sit still and be comfortable with being handled at the vet. So a lot of people do this and it's a breeze, especially if you pick a puppy to do it on. It's super easy and you set that puppy up for vet visits for life. But I thought Bodger needs this, so I have to do this with Bodger. And so it was very slow. And at one point I thought I was going to fail out of the academy because it was so slow. Um, Everyone else had something. There's a retrieve is one of the other assignments. Everyone else struggles with that one. With budget, that was easy. The retrieve, really, it wasn't that hard. But the stay for a vet exam, I thought, this is impossible. How am I ever going to teach budget to do this? So it was really good practice for me in learning how to work very slowly, to have really good mechanics. And I have to thank Jean Donaldson because she had to write me a very special plan just for Bodger in order for me to be able to open his mouth, look at his teeth, and pop a piece of cheese in so that I'd be able to peel him. And that took ages. And I felt like a terrible trainer whenever I made a mistake because he would snarl and snap and growl at me. So I had to really go very slowly. And later on, much later on, I was so glad I had done that because Bodger became very ill. Actually, he had hemangiosarcoma, and we decided to try chemotherapy with him. And at one point, he stopped eating, and he was nauseous because of the chemotherapy. And our normal route for getting pills into him was to put them in food, but he wouldn't eat a thing. And so I had to remember that we'd done that training plan. I foolishly hadn't worked on it since, and I should have worked on it from time to time to keep it going and keep him happy with it. But thanks to having done that, and I think thanks largely to Jean Donaldson, we were able to get a pill in him, my husband and I together, so that he stopped being nauseous. And so I think that's one of the hardest things that I've ever done was actually with my own dog was trying to teach him to let me touch him.
Yeah. It's a good reminder about what our clients are working with sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. And it can be really hard. And the technique matters a lot. And if you get it wrong, it doesn't help at all. So
Yeah. Yeah. So a very smart dog trainer told me once about herself, that anxiety seeks a target. In other words, she feels anxious first. That's a thing she has. And then she sort of casts around, her anxiety sort of casts around looking for a target, And it was coming out of this conversation because she was expressing, oh, I have anxiety about the fact that you're doing this, Christy. And I'm like, oh, do you want me to do something different? And she's like, anxiety seeks a target. Like, it's not going to matter if you do something different. I'm just in an anxious state. And I was like, oh, it really opened my eyes having it framed like that. Like, oh, okay. So I can't just make you feel better by doing something different. So can you talk, I know you talked about this in Bark, but can you talk about the difference between anxiety and fear, and is it the same in people and dogs?
yes, and a lot of what we know about fear and anxiety in dogs actually comes either from research on people or from research on rats and mice. So a lot of the research on fears and coping with fears, it comes from those two things, not so much on dogs. So when we talk about fear, fear is that reaction we have to something that is actually dangerous, whatever it is, like a car coming at you or a bear about to attack you or whatever. And it can therefore be a useful emotion in some cases because it helps to keep you safe, or it helps your dog to stay safe in the face of something that's dangerous. Of course, it can be inappropriate for that situation, and that's when it might be a problem. Anxiety is more when there is a perception of something being dangerous or not safe, but actually that's not really the case. It doesn't really match the circumstances, and it can be very long lasting. And in the case of anxiety, a long lasting anxiety, it can be actually quite bad for the person's health. It can make it, or for the dog's health, because it can just make normal everyday life for the dog quite difficult. And so then there also would be some kinds of veterinary labels that veterinarians would apply to certain situations. And of course, I'm not a vet, so I won't be speaking to those. But it's important to know that if your dog is anxious, that's something that your vet can help with, and your vet will consider, what the issue is and whether or not it's appropriate to prescribe medication.
So Sitka agrees.
Dog in agreement.
So when writing Bark, how did you decide how to balance the personal stories, which I think really give it a hook and really give it sort of depth? And we all know that as an anthropologist, I love stories and I adore storytelling as part of like science communication. But how did you know, how did you decide how to balance those stories with the science that's like the foundation and the backbone? So the information that you really wanted to impart. How did you, what was your thinking there?
It just kind of came about organically, really. And I have made the decision when writing WAG, which I then followed through Per and Bark, that I would include stories about my own pets. And I actually had a discussion with my editor about that because she had concerns that if I was just writing about my own pets, it might be harder for other people to see their pets in it, and maybe to write about clients' pets or other people's pets would also be quite helpful. But at the same time, that gives it less of a through narrative. So in a way, there is a narrative that starts in WAG and tells you about me getting Ghost and Bodger and my cats Harley and Melina, and then you can read about, even in the cat book, you can see some mention of the dogs, and even here in Bark, you can see some mention of the cats. So that's something that comes through all of the books, and in each case, every chapter starts with a story, for one thing, because I think that's the best introduction to the chapter. And I tried to balance the stories with what fitted with the science. So, for example, I have a chapter on fear of loud noises, and we did a lot of work with Bodger on fear of loud noises like loud bangs, like the bear bangers and thunder and fireworks, but also on the sound of the barred owl. So that it was very obvious and easy to decide, okay, Bodger goes in that chapter, and there are lots of stories about him. But then also, when people bring home a new rescue dog, often it can take them quite a while to settle in. And we had recently brought Pepper home. So, that meant that there were places where it was very obvious that stories about Pepper would fit. Pepper is my Shih Tzu. He's adorable. He's gorgeous. And I'll be reading about him shortly. So it largely was organic, and there were stories that ended up not fitting, and I had to take them out, or they had to be shortened. But that's really how it came about.
Love that. That's great. Thank you. So, our last question before you're reading, how do you balance the need to be upfront that we don't know everything, like the underlying cognitive mechanism for counter conditioning, without casting too much doubt on we're living in kind of a science averse world in some contingents. So, how is how did you balance that?
I think that's a great question, and it's one of the things we learn as a scientist is that you have to be upfront when you don't know things. Part of being a scientist is knowing what you know and the limits of what you know. So you get used to saying, actually, we don't know this, and that's partly how you decide to do new studies or something like that. So in part, it comes from my background, but also I think it's really important in the face of so many people trying to deny science. If we made stuff up about science, that would not help our cause at all. So we have to be scientific about it, and we have to be honest about it. And I think it's always disappointing to people, especially like if a radio host asks you a question and you have to say, actually, we don't know. That is not at all what they want to hear. So you have to quickly think of what we do know that you can say. So at least you can tell people something. And I think that's really helpful. But I find it fascinating that there are things that we don't know too, because I write in the book about Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs, and everybody knows the story of Pavlov's dogs. That's kind of become part of the popular consciousness, except that part of the story that we know or think we know, it isn't actually quite what happened. And then there are still things we don't know, even though classical conditioning was discovered so long ago. The fact that there are still things that we don't know about it, I find that fascinating. I think that's really interesting, and that makes me curious and want to know more. So for me, that it's a good thing that we don't know everything yet.
Yeah, that was a great end. It's actually Pavlov. Thinking about Pavlov is kind of what made me think of that question because a while ago I read that Pavlov didn't use a bell; he used a tone. And then every time I write Pavlov's bell since then, I'm always like, "Oh, I'm lying to my adoring public," and it makes me so uncomfortable to say nothing of how Pavlov treated those dogs. Like, so yeah, great answer. So I'm gonna go off camera now, and we're gonna have you do your reading. So if you want to introduce what you're reading, and we'll all give it a listen.
Okay, so I'm going to read from the start of chapter 2 of Bark, which is about how Pepper came into our lives. My husband and I started to look for another dog in the difficult days of the pandemic, having lost Bodger, our beautiful 11-year-old Australian Shepherd, to cancer in early 2020. I was expecting to find a mid to large sized dog and would have loved another Aussie, but the only criterion that mattered was that a new dog should get on with cats. We couldn't tolerate a dog who would be a hazard for our felines, Harley and Melina. But this was the time when the whole world was looking for a dog. Any dog, whatever size or breed, and whatever issues they might have, seemed to go within moments of their listing being posted on the web. And those notices didn't contain the magic words, good with cats. Finally, after about 6 months, there was Pepper. I hadn't planned on getting a Shih Tzu or any kind of little dog, but Pepper's listing had those magic words, good with cats. He was a senior, had just had various medical issues treated, and seemed to love everyone. I showed his photo and bio to my husband and put our application in right away. Soon the call came to say that we could go and meet him. Pepper was 10 years old when he came to live with us. We don't know much about his previous life, but it's clear that someone loved him very much, liked to have him sit on their knee, and fed him human foods, too many human foods. At first, he didn't do very much, and he was so quiet. Aren't little dogs supposed to bark a lot? I thought. But he made no sounds. Then one day, there was an item on the local TV news about some dogs at the shelter we had adopted him from. We recognized the voices of staff members there, and so did he. He ran to the TV and made the strangest, most strangulated bark sounds I've ever heard. It felt as if he was saying, I'm here, I see you, to the people who had cared for him in the shelter, but the sounds just weren't coming out right. All of a sudden, Pepper had found his voice. Yap, yap, he went at dogs walking up the street. An urgent yip, yip, yip when the black bear went through our yard, and little gurrs when he's playing tug. So why was he so quiet when he first moved in? In fact, right at the beginning, he didn't do very much of anything. You could have looked at him and said he was a very good dog. And you wouldn't be wrong, because he is a very good dog, but in reality, he was nervous, too nervous to do anything or to make a sound. Of course, we did everything we could to make him feel at home and safe with us, but it was a big change in his life to come to a new home with new people. He had already spent a while getting used to the shelter and the foster home. Any change was bound to make him shy. Shut down is what we call it when a dog is too scared to really do much, too frightened to do any behaviors. It's often mistaken for being a good dog because the dog isn't misbehaving in any way, but they aren't happy or comfortable. It pays to practice reading dogs' body language so that you can recognize when they're fearful and do something about it. And then that goes into a discussion of how to tell if your dog is fearful or anxious. Thank you.
Beautiful, lovely Zazie. Thanks so much. It's so nice hearing people read their work in their own voices. Can we get Kat back on video? Perfect. So start in on some questions. So the book is about the work you did with your dog Solo, who is trained to detect human remains. How did you get into this, and why was it an activity that was good for Solo?
So it's such a complex answer to this, Christy, but also because Solo was a singleton, and which meant that he was the only pup in his litter, and it made him really uncomfortable around other dogs because he didn't have all that give and take that you get with early socialization with other puppies, where they're trading all these thousands of signals a day, and so he was a very different kind of dog, and I was thinking about obedience classes and all of those things, but it wasn't going to fit him. And I went to a trainer I respected one day, and she suggested having him become at was known at that point as a cadaver dog. And she also talked about the degree to which it's a good activity, because I was a university professor. So search and rescue, where you have to absolutely drop everything and leave. And as she said, the dead can wait, which is literally true, because the more you wait, the greater the scent they can emit. Mm-hmm. And so and we're in North Carolina, so very often we schedule searches for the morning, especially during the hot seasons. And it was one of those things where he changed my life because he loved doing this work, and it was good for him. I will say it was especially good for me as well.
I love it. So many of the authors that Zazie and I are talking to have this sort of split focus on both people and dogs, and this is so nice to hear. That everybody's welfare matters. So, as a little quick follow up, what kind of dog is scent work suited to?
So it varies widely. I mean, the wonderful thing about scent detection dogs is that this is what dogs do, right? Dogs have noses. The vast majority love to use them. And it's funny in a way, Christy, that stuff like nose work has taken off as, where dogs are searching for clove or birch or anise as a scent, because it can really help. It can really help the dogs sort of come out of themselves. Um, and so there are all sorts of dogs who can be good at this. And so in some ways, what are the dogs where they're more limited? Well, the brachycephalic dogs, right? The flat snouts, right? Where they get overheated so quickly. It's a welfare issue overall. But I've seen boxers that are just amazing scent detection dogs. So there's no hard and fast rule.
Right. Awesome. What kind of training did you do with Solo to get him ready to go out on searches?
To bring it back, Christy, to it's about the human. What kind of training did I have to go through to be ready to go out for searches? The fact is he was a dog who actually took to this work, who loved this work. It took me a year and a half, mostly because there was so much for me to learn. He was my first scent detection dog. I was lucky enough to be mentored by canine law enforcement people who were just so good and knowledgeable. And so the year and a half that it took was really all about me. It's true that dogs need to undergo training in all sorts of different situations, and human remains scent is super complex. It's human scent itself is really complex, but human remains scent is very complex. And so you're looking at sort of a range of conditions and a range of kinds of decomposition that you need to get the dog accustomed to so that you're comfortable to say, we're ready to deploy.
When you first answered that, I had this image of you in like a GI Jane situation, doing like pull-ups and wearing fatigues.
Yeah, you bet.
No, not that.
You bet. Well, camouflage, right?
So in a real search, the dog isn't necessarily going to find something. So as a trainer, how do you deal with that?
So it's true that on searches like this, 9 out of 10 times, you're not necessarily going to find someone or something. The areas that you clear are incredibly important, though, because if you think about it, it can be as important to know where somebody isn't as well as where they actually are. And the fact is that dogs need to get accustomed to searching for a long time with blank areas. And so that's part of the training. But I will also say, Christy, that part of this is that scent detection dogs love to hunt, right? And so if you think, when Trisha was talking yesterday about herding dogs, the act of hunting in itself can be rewarding and pleasurable for a dog who loves doing this. And so that notion that there's this end result where they get the toy reward, the fact is that they're getting rewarded all the way along. And so I found ways to praise and to have them keep going. But it's also true that when you're doing that kind of work, you're out for little sections of time because the dogs will overheat and all of those things. So you're going out and you're clearing areas, you're cooling them down. And in between times, you can find ways to play with them and reward them. So it was never an issue.
Fascinating. So working with cemeteries and deceased people is heavy and hard, and working with racialized people in these scenarios even more so. And I know part of my work as an anthropologist, I mapped a couple of cemeteries in a small indigenous community, and I found it really hard, like my heart got involved in a way that I didn't expect. I expected to just go in and treat it as a mapping exercise, but instead found myself feeling emotional, which, in retrospect, of course I did, but I remember feeling a little bit surprised by how much I was feeling. So how do you keep your heart protected, but in this game?
It's a really complicated question, and I think it's a complicated answer, and I think it's different for everybody. I will say that currently I'm not deploying a dog. The fact is that when I was using Solo for searches, it was so incredibly important that he have a good time doing these searches that I would set aside my emotions for the time that we needed to do that. Because and there's also, Christy, and I mean, I think you know this as absolutely as well as I do, that there's empathy, right? But the tragedy isn't your tragedy, okay? The death of somebody, the death of a family member belongs to somebody else. And so it allows me in a way to set that aside. And I think you know as well as I do, that in working with burial grounds and with people who have suffered great harm at the hands often of us, that it's so important to it is a kind of justice work, right? Um, and so you do get involved, but when you're working with dogs, you need to make sure that they're having the time of their life when they're doing that work.
Right, right. Yeah, that adds a whole extra layer, I guess.
It does. And after a homicide search that would be really difficult, usually it would be a few days later that I would start snapping at my poor husband. What we do,
It's how we deal. Yeah, as
it's,
humans.
you know.
Makes perfect sense. So after the success of this book, you wrote a young readers edition. What was the process like of working on a version for young readers?
I cheated, Christy. I literally, I thought, you know what? I kind of need a focus group. I sent the adult book out to a bunch of kids who love dogs and love reading, who were in that age group. And their task was to do two things: tell me where they were bored and tell me the spots where they were too frightened. And and a little fear is fine. What's interesting is that the kids weren't necessarily frightened at the thought places where adults might become frightened. And so it really helped create, right? Because there are spots where, I geek out on the science, right? And so I pulled it back to Solo's story and used Solo's big body to hang elements that I wanted to get across with the trajectory of working with him.
Fascinating.
Is that, yeah.
Yeah. So very quickly before you do your reading, can you just tell us about your new projects?
So I've got two new projects. It was lovely to listen to Patricia McConnell yesterday. I'm about 2/3 of the way through a novel that's on archaeology and dogs. And I love it because there's no deadline. And I love to research this stuff, right? And I'm working on a couple of grants where the use of dogs in archaeology is part of that work. And then I'm working on a kind of a more fun, lighter project, which will be an illustrated book, we hope, on all the different kinds of work that dogs are doing now, all the ways that we have found that they can be, like in Australia, there's a team of dogs working on leak detection for water supplies. So underground tiny leaks that these dogs are able to pinpoint before they get bad. So yeah.
I could actually use that on the farm.
You could see, we could all use it. We could use it in our
I'll use
city,
it.
right?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I don't know if the audience knows, but I'm actually an archaeologist, so I know Kat and I have geeked out together. The very idea that archaeologists can work with dogs is makes me just chortle with glee. So, so I'm going to go
Yes.
off now, and you will do your reading.
Okay. So let me preface, this is about maybe halfway through the book, and it was not the first homicide search that I had gone on with Solo, but this is just a little section from a chapter called Into the Swamp, and it opens there. It was a case where somebody had disappeared into an area where the police were going to have to sweep the swamp with um, with 20 or 30 people if we didn't have luck. As usual, Solo provided extra sound effects, mewling, crooning, sounding more like a great Serengeti cat than a German Shepherd. Even his whiskers twitched. He had on his sturdy nylon harness that could double as a handle to suck him out of the swamp if needed. He hated the harness, since it signaled a bit of constraint in what he thought should be an unconstrained life. It meant he might have to work on a long line. Tough kitty, it was staying on. I ran a final mental checklist: water, water bag, bug spray, tug toys to reward the dog. I hadn't forgotten those as I dashed out of the house. They were as essential as water. My list checking was simple distraction, a rosary of search equipment that slipped easily through my mind. Solo's distractions were more concrete. Dog piss on the rusted jungle gym. Dog piss on the grass, making his tail curl defensively. As we walked towards the woods, children from the nearby apartments, having stood back at first to watch from the distance, now surged around us, chattering like mockingbirds, then leaping back and screaming in exaggerated fear as Solo swung his huge head in their direction and wrinkled his brow. They weren't dogs, they were just little people. He relaxed his tail to wag low and slow, all stiffness gone. Around children, he dialed back both his drive and his rhetoric. Don't worry, he's sweet, I told them. He wasn't always sweet with me, but he was with others. He's big, huh? He won't hurt you. He loves kids. He wasn't a therapy dog, though, so we kept moving the whole time. Before we entered the fickle shade of the mimosas and elderberries and trees of heaven that have colonized and overwhelmed the edges of these Piedmont woods, Solo paused to inhale a last resentful snort of dog piss baked onto a corroded steel post. Then the two investigators, the dog, and I ducked under the yellow crime tape and through a jagged hole in a chain link fence. We straightened up on the other side, and I took one of the rope tug toys out of the training bag and tucked it ostentatiously into my pocket. Solo yowled and spun in delirium, kneecapping me with his big shoulder. I winced and unhooked him from my aching arm. I reminded myself once again that searches were not the time for etiquette lessons. I didn't want him to sit or heel or watch me with adoration. I wanted him to find the body. Unhooked and far more obedient off lead than on, Solo stood frozen, waiting, his eyes fixed outward, then sliced back to my pocket, then down the hill littered with empty liquor bottles, toddler diapers, a shattered big wheel, a rusted washing machine. He didn't need to hear the command, but the words focused and centered me, reminding me that we'd researched this dance for a couple of years. The least I could do was get it started. Solo, go find your fish. He did a final brief tarantella around me, striking the pocket where I'd stashed the toy with his open muzzle. Not a bite. It hurt nonetheless. Then he barked sharply and disappeared into the dense undergrowth.
Oh, thank you so much. It is so great hearing, you speak in your own voice. So we'll get all the authors back on camera. Mark, if you want to Perfect. So we have a plenary question that we're going to ask everyone. So I will start with Zazie. So what brings you hope for the dog-human relationship?
How many people want to learn more about their dogs and how to help their dogs? And in fact, all the people who've come and signed up for BarkFest and all of the amazing authors who are taking part in it, because everybody is so keen to learn, to hear everybody talk. And it's just fantastic. It brings me a lot of hope.
Perfect. Mark, what
You
brings you hope?
Zazie hit it. All the questions that come into me that over the years have become much more sophisticated. I mean, which means that at least I think more and more people are learning more and more about dogs. And what gives me hope is when I ask people a question about their dogs and they say they don't know, because I wrote an essay called "The More I Know, the More I Say I Don't Know." And so it's not meant to be off-putting that it's so complex. I mean, it is more complex than a lot of people make it out to be. But I love that more and more people are asking ethological questions, if you will. So I just say, go to a dog park, pull out your iPhone or whatever thing you carry, and they take videos, they analyze them, and they send them to me. And I love it. And I have a whole lot of people looking at scent marking patterns and humping and mounting patterns, because you're not going to get a federal grant to study humping and mounting. But really, that's what gives me hope is how many people, I mean, because of all the work that you all do, and other participants in this series are putting it out to the public, and people are getting keenly interested. And the bottom line for me is that the more you know, the better that will be, if you will, the dog-human relationship. So that I love that.
I love that too. And I honestly think that your generosity of spirit with answering questions for people, it does such a service for ethology as a discipline, to be honest. So Kat, what brings you hope?
Well, I mean, I can only second what Zazie and Mark said. And I see it actually every day sometimes when we're just driving, and more when I see a person walking with a dog, you can actually see the relationship between them. And it feels as though, now remember, that's a small portion of the whole dog population, but I actually can see the progress in people when they're going out with their dogs. They are more connected, or they are on harness, or the dogs are being allowed to sniff and explore a little bit. So all of those things. And then one final thing is that the science is really interesting, and we are starting to learn. And dog training is actually getting better at that sort of upper end. Ade Schoen, who's a marvelous trainer in the Netherlands and has done a ton of work. She and I love this quote. She said sometimes that she can almost see a dog thinking, "Is that all you want me to do? I can do so much more." Right? And I think that that's really hopeful.
Yeah.
I love it. Thank you guys, all of you. So we have some awesome questions, and sadly, we do not have enough time to answer them all. So I'm just going to kind of quickly choose and assign questions. So I'm going to start with Yasmin, and I'm going to ask Zazie to answer this. When environmental management reaches its limits to create a safe environment for dogs to practice counter conditioning against sounds, is there still a way?
Yes, so the first thing to do in that case would be to speak to your veterinarian, because often your veterinarian will be able to prescribe medications, and they can prescribe short-acting medications to help you get through a specific time, like the 4th of July or bonfire night. And they can also prescribe longer lasting medications. And there are also some things that you can do to mask the sounds and to think about what kind of sounds they are. And Eileen Anderson has done some work on that. She's mentioned in the book and quoted in the book on finding the right kind of sounds to help to mask the sounds that are going on. And that's probably the first part of an answer. Of course, then other specifics would depend on the particular situation.
Okay, Thank you, Zazie. So Mark, Mary asks, pet dogs live very boring, controlled lives today. Is there something you could recommend to improve their lives? That's a big question. Just throw it off your cuff.
That's simple. Well, yeah, find out what challenges them in a positive way and challenge them. Dogs, not all dogs, so I know I can't say that, but a lot of dogs, and all the dogs I lived with in the mountains where they could run free when I was home. I challenged them. On this acreage I had, I'd put out treats about the size of a marble, and there were usually between 3 and 6 dogs there. They'd go out and spend the whole day looking, and then the next day I'd move them around, but challenge them. But I think your question is who asked it is really important, because it can be boring just hanging out around home with the same boring human. Even if the humans aren't boring to other humans, they could be really boring to dogs. But find out what your dog really likes, and challenge it, but not in an aversive way. And I know you all are, that, but play games with them, and understand that they don't see the world or sense the world the way we do. So what we might find easy, they might find challenging. And love them. And I really mean that. Just let them know that you are there for them, all the time. Because why get a dog if you're not there for them all the time?
Yes, truer words. So, Kat, Patricia McConnell asks, would love to hear about would love to hear how the emotion of experience, fear, etc., impact working sniffer dogs.
So thanks, Tricia, for an incredibly complicated question. I think it's a marvelous question, and I think it's one that people have looked at a lot. For instance, the dogs of 9/11 and other places, and they're my current German Shepherd, because he has a fear issue, is not a dog that I'm working in human remains detection. It's not work that he enjoys. We have found things that he enjoys, and I think that I approached it a little bit about how experienced handlers control their own emotions as much as possible. This is also a very other end of the leash question that Patricia's asking here, and that is how does your emotional state impact the dog? And it's why, in a way, some of the really, really tough, good working dogs, we talk about environmental hardness or soundness, that those are the dogs who kind of don't give a crap how you feel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, that's quite literally why, for instance, hunting labs, right? They're not going to pay a lot of attention to what you're thinking or feeling, if they're out hunting, searching for scent. And I think it's something to keep in mind. It's also why, in a way, if we think about partnerships, right, with working dogs, that to be very good partners, you have to the degree possible, divorce yourself and trust the dog to be doing their part while you help them lead and do their part, right? So it's a marvelous question, and I'm gonna stop it there because I know that we're short on time. But thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm just gonna hop in super quick. I know Zazie is just about ready to say she's done, but I want everyone to just say like the shortest sentence possible to address this. I'm gonna do a round robin again because I love this question so much. What do you wish you could tell younger you about the work that you do? So just make it real short, but let's start with Kat.
Not taking everything personally.
Yes.
And
Oh, I love that.
listen to your dog. Learn what your dog is telling you, right? That's 2 pieces of advice.
I love it. Zazie?
I would say I would never have imagined that I would have ended up working with dogs. So I would just say go with things. When you see opportunities for things to change, your life can change in ways that you can't imagine. Just go with it and enjoy it when you get those opportunities.
Perfect. Mark?
Follow your heart and follow your dreams, and don't let anybody tell you you can't do what you really want to do.
Beautiful advice. I'll pass it now back over to Zazie. Thank you for putting up with me questioning.
Thank you, Christy, and a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Special thanks to Marc Bekoff and to Kat Warren for talking about your books and for such beautiful readings. And it's been wonderful to hear you. And thank you to our audience for coming. Thank you to Christy for doing such an amazing job of hosting, and also to my publisher, Greystone Books, for some help behind the scenes. So in a moment, when the video has processed, I'm going to be doing a draw. So just a reminder, one person has a chance to win a copy of my new book, Bark, which is out on the 1st of October, and it's available for pre-order now, of Kat's book, What the Dog Knows, and that's going to be a signed copy, a special signed copy, and of two of Marc Bekoff's books, The Emotional Lives of Animals and Dogs Demystified as well. And then 2 other people are also going to get a signed copy of Kat's book, and it has a very special, it's very special in the way that it's signed, because it includes a nose print. I'm very lucky, I have a signed copy.
I love
So
it.
just to show you what some people are going to win, which is amazing, and those can go globally to anywhere, wherever you are. So this is not the end of the conversation. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but I think we'll try and get Kat back at some point. We have Marc Bekoff coming back, so if you haven't yet signed up to hear Marc talking about the emotional lives of animals next week, do so now. I also just want to highlight all this other sessions coming up, they still have room. And we have a session, our next session is on Thursday, and that's with canine crime and mystery authors Anthony Johnston, Louisa Scarr, and Philip Schott, DVM. And if you like reading about dogs doing the kind of work that Solo does, you can find those in that book. So they are all novels in which a dog has an important role, and in some cases a sniffer dog, and they're adorable dogs. So that's on Thursday, so please be sure to sign up to that one as well. And then finally, thank you so much to all of you. A special thanks again to Marc and Kat, and hope to see you next time as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you, Christy, everybody. Nice meeting you. That was lovely. Thank you.
All for coming. Really great.
Thank you.